A frozen German shepherd mother and her tiny pup stood tied to a wooden post beside a lonely mountain road, snow burying their bodies in a raging blizzard. No one stopped until a quiet pickup truck slowed, driven by a 64-year-old Navy SEAL who thought his life was already over. Before the story continues, tell us where you're watching from today. Drop your city or country in the comments so we can see how far this story travels. Winter had settled heavily over the high mountains outside the small town of Silver Hollow, Colorado. The kind of deep winter that made the sky and earth look like one endless sheet of pale gray silence. Snow had been falling since early afternoon, and by evening, the narrow mountain road that curved along the ridges above the valley had nearly disappeared beneath drifts of wind-blown white. Pine trees bent under the weight of ice and snow, their branches creaking softly whenever a gust of wind pushed through the forest. It was the sort of storm locals learned to respect because it arrived quietly but could swallow roads, fences, and even the courage of men who thought they had seen worse weather in their lives. Nathan Brooks drove slowly through that storm, both hands steady on the worn steering wheel of his aging, dark blue pickup truck, the heater humming weakly, while snowflakes swirled through the beams of his headlights like restless spirits. Nathan Brooks was 64 years old, a retired Navy SEAL whose broad shoulders and strong hands still carried the shape of a man who had spent most of his life in disciplined service. His face was weathered and square, with a jaw that seemed carved from stubborn stone, and a short gray beard that had grown thicker since retirement. His hair, once black, had turned a mixture of steel gray and winter white around the temples, and deep lines ran from the corners of his eyes down toward his mouth, the kind that came from both laughter and long years of responsibility. People in Silver Hollow sometimes described him as quiet but dependable, the sort of man who helped shovel a neighbor's driveway without saying much, and then disappeared again into the trees near Echo Lake, where he lived alone in a small cabin. 3 years earlier, his wife, Margaret Brooks, had died after a sudden illness, and though Nathan rarely spoke about it, something inside him had folded inward since then, leaving him more comfortable with silence than conversation. Tonight, he was not driving toward any particular destination. He had simply left his cabin before the storm worsened, intending to pick up a few supplies from town before the road became impassable. But halfway along the mountain pass he slowed, his eyes narrowing slightly as something unusual appeared in the wavering light ahead. At first, it looked like a dark shape against the snow, something low beside a wooden roadside marker post that marked the edge of the steep drop toward the forest below. Nathan eased his foot off the gas pedal and leaned forward slightly, instinct sharpening in the quiet way it always had during his years in the military. As the truck rolled closer, the headlights illuminated the scene more clearly, and what he saw made his chest tighten. A wooden post stood half buried in snow beside the road, and tied to it with a rough coil of rope was a German shepherd mother dog. Her body was rigid from cold, her black and tan fur almost completely hidden beneath a thick layer of frozen snow. Long, delicate strands of ice hung from her belly and muzzle like glass threads. Pressed tightly against her legs was a small German shepherd puppy, no more than a few weeks old, its tiny body trembling weakly beneath the same blanket of snow. The rope around the mother's neck was wound so tightly around the post that she could barely move. Yet somehow she remained standing, her body angled against the wind so that the puppy remained sheltered beneath her chest. Nathan stopped the truck immediately and turned off the engine, the sudden quiet of the storm rushing in around him as he opened the door. The wind struck his face like a sheet of needles, and snow blew sideways across the road, but he stepped forward anyway, boots crunching heavily against the frozen surface. The mother dog lifted her head as he approached. Her amber eyes were tired and rimmed with frost, but there was still something fierce in them, a stubborn determination that Nathan recognized instantly. He had seen that same look on soldiers who refused to fall even when everything around them was collapsing. "Easy there," he murmured softly, crouching a few feet away so he would not startle her. His voice was calm and low, the tone of someone used to steadying frightened beings whether they were men or animals. The dog did not growl. Instead, she watched him carefully, breathing in short clouds of fog that vanished instantly in the wind. Nathan reached slowly into the pocket of his heavy coat and pulled out a small folding knife, the same tool he carried everywhere out of long habit. The rope had frozen stiff from ice, but after a moment of careful sawing, the fibers snapped loose. The instant the rope fell away, the mother dog staggered forward slightly yet did not attempt to run. Instead, she pressed her body closer over the puppy, as though the only thing that mattered in the entire storm was the tiny life beneath her. Nathan exhaled slowly, something heavy shifting inside his chest. "You stubborn girl," he whispered gently. He slipped off one glove and extended his bare hand slowly toward her nose. The dog sniffed once, hesitated, and then lowered her head slightly in what looked almost like exhausted acceptance. Nathan moved quickly then, lifting the trembling puppy first and tucking it carefully inside his coat against his chest where the warmth might reach it. The tiny heartbeat fluttered weakly against his ribs. Then he wrapped one strong arm around the mother dog and guided her carefully toward the truck. She walked slowly beside him, legs stiff but determined, never letting her eyes leave the small bundle inside Nathan's coat. Back inside the truck, the heater pushed warm air through the cab again as Nathan placed the puppy gently on the passenger seat and helped the mother climb up beside it. For a moment, he simply sat there, watching the two of them. The dog curled instinctively around the puppy, licking the frost from its ears while her own body continued to tremble from exhaustion. Nathan rubbed a hand across his beard and stared out through the windshield where snow continued to fall across the empty road. He did not know who had left them there or why anyone would tie living creatures to a post in the middle of a mountain storm. But he knew one thing with quiet certainty. Leaving them there had never been an option. He closed the truck door firmly, started the engine, and glanced once more at the two fragile lives beside him before speaking softly into the warm air of the cab. "All right," he said. "Let's get you out of here." Miles away in the center of Silver Hollow, Linda Harper stood inside the warm glow of a small shop called Harper Books and Coffee, wiping the last table before closing early for the night. Linda Harper was 57 years old, a slender woman with gentle posture and soft chestnut-brown hair streaked lightly with silver that she usually tied into a loose bun at the back of her head. Her eyes were a calm hazel color that seemed to carry both kindness and quiet resilience. She had once worked as a school librarian before she and her late husband opened the little bookstore cafe together. After he passed away 3 winters ago from a sudden heart attack, Linda kept the shop running alone, serving coffee and conversation to the handful of townspeople who still braved the cold to gather there. She glanced through the frosted front window at the thickening snow outside and sighed softly, unaware that somewhere beyond the mountains, a lone truck was already turning away from the storm with 2 nearly frozen lives inside it. Back on the mountain road, Nathan shifted the truck into gear and slowly pulled forward again, the headlights cutting through the snow while the mother dog lifted her head and watched him with quiet, cautious trust. Nathan glanced toward her once before turning his eyes back to the road and speaking in a voice barely louder than the wind outside. "All right," he said gently. "We're leaving this place behind." The storm followed Nathan Brooks down the winding road that led toward Echo Lake, though by the time the truck turned off the main pass and rolled onto the narrower trail toward his cabin, the wind had softened slightly into a long whisper through the trees. Snow continued falling in quiet layers that softened every edge of the forest, covering fallen branches and old fence posts until the world seemed newly built from white silence. Nathan drove carefully, the tires crunching over frozen gravel beneath the snow, while the faint orange glow of the truck's dashboard lit the lines of his weathered face. He kept glancing toward the passenger seat where the German Shepherd mother lay curled around the small puppy, both animals still trembling despite the warm air filling the cab. The mother dog's fur once hidden beneath snow and ice, now revealed thick black and copper tones beneath melting frost. Strands of water dripped slowly from her coat onto the truck seat, forming small dark circles on the fabric. The puppy pressed itself against her chest, its tiny ears flattened and its breathing shallow but steady. Nathan exhaled quietly through his nose, watching them with the same steady attention he once used when checking wounded teammates after a difficult mission. The road curved around the edge of Echo Lake, which lay completely frozen beneath a pale sheet of ice that reflected the dim glow of the storm clouds above. His cabin stood on the far side of the lake among tall spruce trees, a modest wooden structure built decades earlier by his father and repaired many times since. It was not large, but it was sturdy, with thick pine walls and a stone chimney that rose crookedly above the roofline like an old soldier refusing to fall. Nathan parked the truck beside the small porch and stepped out into the snow, the cold air rushing around him again. He opened the passenger door and carefully lifted the puppy first, tucking it inside his coat where his body heat might help revive it further. The mother dog climbed down more slowly, her legs stiff from hours in the cold. For a moment she stood beside the truck, looking at Nathan with tired amber eyes that held both caution and gratitude. "Come on," Nathan said, gently, his voice calm and patient. "Let's get you warm." Inside the cabin, the air felt just as cold as the night outside. Nathan set the puppy down on a thick wool blanket near the stone fireplace before quickly gathering dry firewood from the crate stacked beside the wall. His movements were practiced and efficient, shaped by years of discipline that never truly left a man who had served as long as he had. Within minutes, the fire caught, flames licking upward through the pine logs and filling the room with a steady orange glow. The warmth spread slowly, pushing back the chill that had settled deep into the wooden floorboards. The mother dog watched carefully from near the doorway until Nathan stepped aside and gestured toward the fire. She moved forward cautiously, lowering herself beside the puppy and curling her body protectively around it again. Steam rose faintly from her coat as the ice melted, revealing long, thick fur that suggested she had once been a strong and healthy animal. Nathan crouched beside them and studied the pair more closely. The puppy was small but alert despite its exhaustion, its dark eyes blinking slowly as it lifted its head toward him. Nathan rubbed a hand across his beard thoughtfully before speaking. "You look like a ruby," he said quietly, nodding toward the mother dog. She tilted her head slightly at the sound of his voice. Then he glanced down at the puppy. "And you," he added with a faint smile that barely lifted the corners of his mouth. "You're Finn." The names seemed to settle naturally into the quiet cabin, as though the two animals had been waiting for them all along. Ruby rested her head on the blanket beside Finn and closed her eyes halfway, the tension slowly draining from her body now that warmth surrounded them. Nathan leaned back against the wall for a moment, listening to the fire crackle and the wind brushing against the windows. For the first time that evening, the cabin no longer felt empty. Meanwhile, in the center of Silver Hollow, Linda Harper had finished wiping down the last counter inside Harper Books and Coffee. The small shop smelled faintly of roasted coffee beans and old paperbacks, the comforting scent of stories waiting patiently on wooden shelves that lined the walls. Linda moved slowly through the quiet room, turning off the lamps one by one. She was a woman whose presence carried a quiet warmth that regular customers had grown to appreciate over the years. Though she was 57, the gentle kindness in her face softened the lines of age that winter and loss had etched there. Her hazel eyes held a thoughtful calm, and her chestnut hair, threaded now with silver, was loosely tied behind her neck. After her husband Daniel Harper died 3 years earlier, many friends expected Linda to sell the shop and leave town. Instead, she kept the cafe open every winter evening so that elderly residents of Silver Hollow had somewhere warm to sit and talk when the cold nights grew long. But lately, the chairs had been emptier than before. The storm tonight had kept nearly everyone home, leaving Linda alone with a worn hardcover novel resting open on the table beside her mug of tea. She sat down by the window and began reading again, though her thoughts wandered more than the story on the page. Running the shop alone had grown harder each winter, yet something in her refused to give it up. The place had been her husband's dream as much as hers, and keeping it alive felt like honoring a promise she still carried quietly in her heart. Back at Echo Lake, the fire burned stronger now, filling the cabin with steady warmth. Nathan had changed into a dry flannel shirt and placed an old metal bowl of water near the fire for the dogs. Ruby drank carefully before nudging the bowl toward Finn, who lapped clumsily at the surface. Nathan watched the small moment with quiet fascination. Even exhausted and injured, Ruby's instinct to protect and guide the puppy remained stronger than anything else. It reminded him of something he had not allowed himself to think about for a long time: the quiet strength of loyalty that existed without expectation. The wind outside softened further, until only faint snow tapped against the windows. Nathan leaned forward and placed another log on the fire. When he turned back, Ruby had risen slowly from the blanket. She walked toward him with careful steps, her body still stiff but determined. Nathan remained still, allowing her to approach at her own pace. She stopped beside him, studying his face for a long moment as though deciding something important. Then Ruby lowered her head gently onto his knee. Nathan froze for a second, surprised by the sudden gesture of trust. He slowly placed his hand on her neck, feeling the warmth of living fur beneath his palm. Ruby exhaled softly, her tail giving a faint thump against the wooden floor. Something inside Nathan shifted quietly in that moment, like a door opening after years of remaining closed. Morning came slowly to the mountains around Echo Lake, the storm having passed during the night but leaving behind a thick blanket of untouched snow that reflected the pale winter sunlight like a field of quiet glass. The forest looked newly sculpted. Branches bowed under white weight while faint mist drifted above the frozen surface of the lake. Inside the cabin, Nathan Brooks woke early, as he always had even after retirement, his body still shaped by decades of disciplined routine. The fire had burned low during the night, but still glowed faintly in the stone fireplace, its embers casting a dim orange glow across the wooden floor. Nathan rose from the old leather chair where he had dozed and added another log to the fire before glancing toward the wool blanket near the hearth. Ruby lay curled protectively around Finn, her thick coat now dry and warm, the deep black and rust-colored fur showing clearly in the morning light. The puppy stirred first, stretching its small paws and blinking at the room as if trying to understand this new world of warmth and quiet. Ruby lifted her head and watched Nathan with steady amber eyes that seemed calmer than the night before, though a cautious alertness still lingered in her posture. Nathan crouched beside them and poured fresh water into the metal bowl. Finn waddled forward with clumsy determination and began drinking noisily while Ruby observed carefully before lowering her head to lap a few slow mouthfuls herself. Nathan felt a faint smile tug at the edge of his beard. The small sounds of life inside the cabin, the crackle of firewood, the puppy's tiny footsteps, the dog's steady breathing, had replaced the silence that had dominated the place for years. He had not realized how loud silence could be until it disappeared. Outside, the sky had cleared to a pale blue when Nathan stepped onto the porch with a mug of black coffee warming his hands. The cold air carried the sharp scent of pine and clean snow. He stood quietly for a moment, looking across the frozen surface of Echo Lake where sunlight flashed across the ice like scattered mirrors. That was when he noticed movement on the narrow trail that curved through the trees toward his cabin. A tall figure was approaching slowly through the snow, pushing aside branches with the steady patience of someone who had walked that path many times before. The man who finally emerged into the clearing was Walter Green, Nathan's nearest neighbor, though the two cabins sat nearly half a mile apart through the forest. Walter Green was 71 years old and carried the kind of sturdy build that sometimes remains long after youth has faded. His shoulders were broad but slightly stooped from age, and his face was framed by a thick white mustache and a short beard that had once been dark but had turned completely silver over the years. The deep lines around his eyes suggested a lifetime spent squinting into smoke and sunlight. Walter had served as a firefighter in Silver Hollow for more than 3 decades, earning a reputation in town as a dependable man who rarely spoke loudly but always arrived when someone needed help. A warehouse fire 15 years earlier had nearly taken his life when part of a roof collapsed beside him, leaving a long scar across his left forearm and a lingering stiffness in his shoulder that winter cold often aggravated. But the experience had never changed the calm steadiness in his voice or the quiet humor people appreciated when the days grew difficult. Walter lifted one gloved hand in greeting as he reached the porch. "Morning, Nathan," he called in a voice roughened slightly by age, but still strong. "Saw smoke from your chimney this morning. Figured you'd made it through the storm." Nathan nodded once and stepped aside to let the older man approach the door. "Morning, Walter. Fire kept things warm enough." Walter stamped the snow from his boots before stepping inside the cabin. His sharp gray eyes immediately noticed Ruby and Finn near the fire. He stopped in the doorway for a moment, studying them carefully. "Well now," he said quietly, "looks like the storm delivered more than snow last night." Ruby watched him cautiously but did not growl. Walter crouched slowly, resting one hand on his knee as he examined the dog with the careful attention of someone used to reading small details in dangerous situations. "German Shepherd," he murmured. "Good breed. Loyal. Smart." His eyes moved over Ruby's frame, noting the thinness along her ribs and the faint marks where rope had once tightened around her neck. "This one's been through something rough." Nathan leaned against the wall beside the fireplace, found them tied to a post on the ridge road. Walter's eyebrows lifted slightly, though his voice remained calm. "People can surprise you in the worst ways sometimes." Ruby shifted slightly, placing her body closer to Finn as if to reassure herself the puppy remained safe. Walter watched her quietly for a moment longer before speaking again. "You know," he said, his tone thoughtful, "I've seen dogs like this before. Fire calls sometimes bring you to strange places. Abandoned houses, farms gone quiet, dogs waiting for someone who never comes back." He nodded toward Ruby. "But this one's different." Nathan raised an eyebrow. "How so?" Walter straightened slowly, joints creaking faintly as he rose. "Look at her eyes. The dog didn't give up out there." He gave a faint smile beneath his mustache. "Animals like that don't just survive storms. They fight them." Nathan glanced down at Ruby and Finn again. Something in Walter's words echoed quietly in his thoughts. Meanwhile, in Silver Hollow, the morning crowd had begun trickling into Harper Books and Coffee. Linda Harper stood behind the counter pouring fresh coffee into thick ceramic mugs while a small group of regular customers settled into their usual chairs near the window. The shop felt warmer today, the sunlight reflecting off snow outside and filling the room with gentle light. Among the customers was Harold Finch, a retired mechanic with thick eyebrows and a round face permanently reddened by years of cold weather. Harold leaned back in his chair and began telling a story in his usual loud voice. "You hear about that old seal fella living up near Echo Lake?" he asked the others. A younger woman named Claire Benson, a schoolteacher in her early 30s with short blonde hair and curious blue eyes, looked up from her notebook. "The one who keeps to himself?" Harold nodded. "That's the one. Folks say he moved back a few months ago, but barely comes into town." Linda paused slightly as she wiped the counter. She had heard the rumors too, but had never met the man. "Some people just prefer quiet," she said gently. Harold shrugged. Maybe, but people who live alone up there tend to have stories. Claire smiled faintly. Everyone has stories. Linda glanced toward the snowy hills beyond the town windows and wondered briefly what sort of man would choose to live alone beside Echo Lake through winters like this one. Back at the cabin, Walter finished examining Ruby and gave Nathan a slow nod. "That dog survived more than you might think," he said quietly. Then he looked around the warm cabin and the small puppy now playing clumsily beside the fire. "Funny thing about rescues," Walter added, resting one hand on the back of a chair. Nathan waited. Walter smiled faintly and said in a calm voice that carried both experience and kindness, "Sometimes we think we're the ones doing the saving, but truth is, we might need them just as much." The next morning, over Echo Lake arrived with a strange, fragile calm that often followed heavy mountain storms, the sky pale and clear, while sunlight touched the frozen surface of the lake with faint silver light. Snow still lay thick around Nathan Brooks's cabin, but the wind had quieted and the forest seemed to be breathing again after the long night of cold. Inside the cabin, the fire burned steadily in the stone hearth while Nathan crouched near the blanket where Ruby and Finn rested. Finn had grown more energetic overnight, stumbling around the wooden floor on unsteady legs, occasionally slipping as his paws tried to understand the smooth boards beneath them. Ruby watched him carefully, her head low but alert, though Nathan noticed something in the way she shifted her weight. When she stood, she avoided placing pressure on her front leg, lifting it slightly as if the movement caused pain. Nathan's eyes narrowed with the same instinctive awareness that had guided him through dangerous missions years earlier. He leaned closer, gently brushing the thick fur aside near her paw. Beneath the black and copper coat, he saw the injury clearly for the first time. The rope that had held Ruby to the roadside post had cut deep into the skin around her leg. The wound was raw and red beneath the fur, swollen from days of pressure and freezing temperatures. Ice had hidden the injury the night before, but now the warmth of the cabin revealed its full severity. Ruby did not growl when he touched the area, but she lowered her ears slightly and released a soft breath through her nose. Nathan exhaled slowly, a familiar sense of responsibility settling across his shoulders. "You've been tougher than you should have had to be," he murmured quietly. He wrapped the leg gently with a strip of clean cloth from an old first aid kit, though he knew it would not be enough. Injuries like that needed proper care. He stood and reached for his coat. Ruby watched him closely as he lifted Finn and carried the small puppy toward the truck waiting outside. The drive into Silver Hollow took nearly 40 minutes along winding roads that cut through the forest. Sunlight reflected off snowbanks while the mountains rose silent on either side of the narrow road. Ruby sat quietly on the truck seat beside Finn, her amber eyes moving between Nathan and the passing trees outside the window. When the truck finally rolled into town, the buildings of Silver Hollow appeared slowly from the white landscape. Small wooden storefronts gathered along the main road like a cluster of stubborn survivors against winter. Nathan parked in front of a modest building with a green wooden sign that read Moore Veterinary Clinic. The sign swung slightly in the cold wind. Inside the clinic, the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and warm hay. Shelves along the walls held jars of medicine, while a large wooden desk stood near the entrance. Behind it stood Dr. Daniel Moore, a man in his early 50s whose calm presence filled the small room with quiet assurance. Daniel Moore was tall and lean, with narrow shoulders and long hands that moved carefully when handling animals. His hair had turned prematurely gray along the temples, though the rest remained dark and neatly combed. A pair of rectangular glasses rested low on his nose, giving him the thoughtful look of someone who observed the world before speaking about it. Many people in Silver Hollow trusted him not only because of his skill, but because of his patience. Years earlier, his young daughter had been injured in a car accident that left her with a permanent limp, and the experience had deepened his compassion for suffering creatures, whether human or animal. He stepped forward as Nathan entered. "Morning," Daniel said in a voice calm and steady. His eyes quickly moved to Ruby and Finn. "Looks like someone had a rough night." Nathan placed Finn gently on the examination table while Ruby stood beside him. "Found them tied to a post up on the ridge road," Nathan explained. Daniel's expression tightened slightly as he knelt to examine Ruby's leg. He ran his fingers carefully along the wound, his touch precise but gentle. Ruby flinched slightly but remained still. "This rope burn is deep," Daniel said quietly. "She's been tied there for days, maybe longer. The cold slowed the infection, but that storm nearly finished the job." Nathan felt his jaw tighten. He had seen cruelty before, but something about the quiet loyalty in Ruby's eyes made it harder to accept. Daniel cleaned the wound carefully, applying antiseptic and wrapping the leg with fresh bandages. Finn watched from the table, his head tilting curiously at every movement. The puppy's fur had dried into soft black and tan patches, though one small white mark on his chest made him look younger and slightly clumsier than he really was. While Daniel worked, the clinic door opened softly and a gust of cold air slipped into the room. Nathan glanced up and saw a woman step inside carrying a small basket covered with a folded cloth. Linda Harper paused near the doorway, brushing snow from her coat. She wore a long wool scarf wrapped loosely around her neck and a dark green coat that contrasted with the light brown of her hair. Her face held a gentle calm that people often associated with quiet strength rather than fragile kindness. Linda had developed the habit of bringing leftover bread or soup from her cafe to the clinic for injured animals that passed through Daniel's care. She believed small acts of comfort mattered even to creatures that could not speak. "Morning, Daniel," she said softly. Then her eyes moved toward Nathan and the two dogs. For a brief moment, she simply observed them. Nathan noticed the curiosity in her gaze, but also the warmth behind it. Linda stepped closer and set the basket down near the desk. Finn sniffed the air and wagged his tiny tail uncertainly. Linda knelt slowly beside the table, her movements gentle so she would not frighten the puppy. "Hello there," she murmured quietly. Finn tilted his head and stepped toward her hand. She brushed her fingers lightly across the soft fur on his head, smiling as the puppy licked her knuckles. Ruby watched the interaction carefully, but did not object. Daniel finished tying the bandage around Ruby's leg and stepped back. "She'll heal," he said to Nathan. "Strong dog, but she'll need rest and warmth." Linda glanced up at Nathan then, her hazel eyes thoughtful. Nathan realized he had not smiled in front of a stranger in years. Yet, as Finn leaned against Linda's hand and Ruby rested calmly beside him, something in the quiet room softened the guarded walls he had built around himself for so long. A faint smile appeared beneath his gray beard before he could stop it. The late afternoon sky above Echo Lake dimmed into a pale gray silence as winter evening slowly settled over the mountains again. Snow from the earlier storm remained untouched across the forest, reflecting the fading light like a quiet ocean of white stretching between the dark outlines of pine trees. Inside Nathan Brooks's cabin, the fire in the stone hearth burned steadily, filling the small room with the comforting smell of pine wood and warmth that slowly seeped into the thick log walls. Ruby rested on a folded blanket close to the fire, her bandaged leg stretched gently in front of her while Finn wandered clumsily across the wooden floor nearby. The puppy had seemed stronger during the ride home from Silver Hollow earlier that day, even curious enough to explore the cabin in short bursts of wobbling steps. But as evening deepened, Nathan began to notice the change. Finn's breathing had grown slower, and his tiny body trembled again despite the warmth of the fire. Nathan crouched beside him, his large hands moving carefully as he lifted the puppy into his palms. Finn's fur felt warm, but his breathing came in shallow, uneven bursts. Nathan frowned slightly beneath his gray beard. He had seen signs like this before in injured soldiers and in stray animals rescued during his years living alone in the mountains. Exposure to the storm had pushed the puppy's small body too far. Ruby watched every movement from the blanket, her amber eyes alert and filled with concern. She stood slowly, despite the pain in her leg, and limped closer, placing her nose gently against Finn's side, as if checking the tiny heartbeat within him. Nathan exhaled slowly. "Easy, girl," he murmured quietly, though his voice carried the calm steadiness of a man used to hiding worry beneath discipline. He wrapped Finn carefully inside a dry wool cloth and held him near the fire, hoping the warmth would help the puppy regain strength. Outside, the sky darkened quickly as clouds rolled over the mountains again. Nathan glanced toward the window and made a quick decision. He stepped to the small radio on the shelf and called the veterinary clinic in town. The signal crackled faintly before Daniel Moore's voice answered through the static. "Moore speaking." Nathan explained the situation briefly, describing Finn's symptoms with the concise clarity of someone trained to communicate during emergencies. Daniel listened carefully. "Keep him warm," the veterinarian said calmly. "If his breathing slows further, I'll drive up there. It's not the safest road tonight, but a puppy that young won't make it if we wait too long." Nathan nodded, even though Daniel could not see him through the radio. "Understood." Ruby had settled beside Nathan again, her body pressed close to Finn's small form, as if her warmth alone might keep him alive. The cabin grew quiet except for the soft crackle of firewood and the occasional whisper of wind against the roof. Hours passed slowly. Finn's breathing grew weaker and his small chest barely moved beneath the wool cloth. Nathan sat cross-legged near the hearth, holding the puppy close to his chest. The steady rhythm of his own breathing seemed to guide the tiny body in his hands. Ruby remained beside him without moving, her head resting near Finn's paw. Near midnight, a faint knock sounded at the cabin door. Nathan looked up quickly and rose to open it. Cold air rushed inside as the door swung open, revealing Daniel Moore standing on the porch with a medical bag slung over his shoulder. Snowflakes clung to his dark coat and the wind had reddened his face during the long drive from town. "Figured I'd better come myself," Daniel said quietly as he stepped inside. He knelt beside Nathan and examined Finn carefully, placing 2 fingers against the puppy's chest to feel the weak heartbeat. Daniel's calm eyes studied the small body with the patience of someone who had spent decades fighting fragile battles like this. "He's still fighting," Daniel said softly. "But he's exhausted." He prepared a small syringe of warmed fluids and administered it carefully while Nathan held Finn steady. Ruby watched the process with intense focus, though she did not interfere. The hours after midnight passed slowly. The fire burned low, but Nathan kept adding small logs to maintain warmth in the room. Daniel remained seated beside him, occasionally checking Finn's breathing while offering quiet reassurance. Outside, the forest had grown still again, the night air frozen and silent. Around 2 in the morning, another set of headlights appeared through the trees outside the cabin. Nathan looked toward the window in surprise before hearing a soft knock. When he opened the door, he found Linda Harper standing on the porch, wrapped in a heavy wool coat and thick scarf. Snow dusted the shoulders of her coat, and she carried a metal container with steam rising faintly from its lid. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, but her eyes held the same calm warmth Nathan remembered from the clinic earlier that day. Daniel called the cafe before he left town. She explained gently as she stepped inside, "I thought you might need something warm." She set the container on the small wooden table and removed the lid, revealing a pot of vegetable soup whose rich scent filled the room instantly. Linda poured 2 cups and handed one to Nathan before kneeling beside Ruby and Finn. Ruby lifted her head and studied Linda carefully, but the dog seemed to recognize the same gentle presence she had shown earlier at the clinic. Linda reached out slowly and brushed her fingers across Finn's head. Poor little traveler, she whispered softly. The puppy barely moved. Nathan took a slow sip of soup, realizing how exhausted he had become. Linda remained seated near Ruby, occasionally speaking in a quiet voice that filled the cabin with a kind of calm presence. After a while, she glanced toward Nathan and said, "My husband used to say something whenever winters felt too heavy." Nathan looked up. Linda's gaze drifted toward the firelight reflecting on the wooden walls. "He used to say there's no place truly cold if someone chooses to stay beside you." The words settled gently into the quiet room. Ruby rested her head against Finn again, while Nathan watched the small rise and fall of the puppy's chest. Hours continued to pass. Outside, the first faint hint of dawn began to touch the sky with pale blue light. Nathan had not moved from the floor since midnight. Daniel leaned forward suddenly, his hand resting lightly against Finn's chest. "Wait," he murmured. Nathan held his breath. Finn's small body twitched slightly beneath the blanket. Then the puppy inhaled sharply, releasing a tiny squeak that broke the long silence. Ruby lifted her head instantly and licked the puppy's ear, while Nathan felt a deep breath escape his chest. The long night had not taken him after all. The morning after the long night felt fragile and strangely hopeful as pale sunlight filtered through the frost-covered windows of Nathan Brooks's cabin beside Echo Lake. A thin mist hovered above the frozen lake, drifting slowly across the silent forest while the snow from previous storms lay thick and undisturbed beneath the tall pine trees. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned low again, though the warmth lingering in the logs kept the small room comfortable. Nathan sat on a wooden chair near the hearth while Finn slept curled inside a folded blanket beside Ruby. The puppy's breathing was steady now, though still soft and delicate like the rhythm of a small clock just beginning to tick again. Ruby remained close to him, her bandaged legs stretched carefully across the blanket. Her amber eyes watched every movement in the cabin with quiet alertness, as though she had accepted Nathan as part of the small pack she protected. Nathan leaned forward and gently scratched behind her ears, a habit he had discovered Ruby seemed to appreciate. For the first time in years, the cabin did not feel like a place built only for survival. It felt like something closer to a home, but winter in the mountains rarely allowed peaceful moments to last for long. By midday, the sky beyond the lake began to darken once again, as thick gray clouds rolled over the distant ridges. The wind slowly returned, whispering through the forest before growing stronger by the hour. Nathan stepped outside onto the porch and studied the sky with experienced eyes. Years of military training and decades living in the mountains had taught him how to read storms the way sailors read the ocean. Another blizzard was building beyond the mountains, moving faster than expected. He stepped back inside and added more logs to the fire before checking the roof through the window. The previous storm had packed heavy snow along the edge of the cabin roof. If the wind strengthened again, the weight might cause damage. Nathan grabbed his coat and stepped outside once more, climbing carefully onto the small ladder beside the cabin wall. Ruby followed him to the door, but stopped there, watching anxiously as he disappeared above the porch roof. The wind was sharper now, pushing loose snow across the frozen ground in swirling clouds. Nathan moved slowly along the edge of the roof, using a long wooden shovel to clear the thick accumulation of snow. His boots dug carefully into the icy surface while his breath formed white clouds in the cold air. For several minutes he worked steadily, pushing the heavy snow away from the roofline. Then the wind suddenly shifted. A sharp gust swept across the cabin, catching Nathan off balance. His boot slipped against a patch of hidden ice, and his body lurched sideways. The shovel fell from his hands as he struggled to regain balance. For a moment he almost succeeded. Then his foot slid again. Nathan crashed against the edge of the roof and tumbled onto the snow-covered ground beside the cabin. The impact knocked the breath from his chest and pain shot through his leg as he landed awkwardly. He remained still for several seconds, staring up at the gray sky while snowflakes drifted down around him. Inside the cabin, Ruby began barking sharply, her voice echoing against the wooden walls. Nathan forced himself to sit up, gripping his thigh with one hand as he tested the injured leg. The pain was sharp, but not unbearable. A strain or heavy bruise, perhaps, though walking would not be easy. He pushed himself slowly to his feet and limped towards the door. The wind had grown stronger now, rattling the cabin walls and pushing snow against the windows. Inside, Ruby rushed toward him immediately, her tail stiff with worry, while Finn stumbled after her on unsteady paws. Nathan leaned heavily against the table and took a slow breath. He glanced toward the small furnace unit in the corner of the cabin that helped circulate warmth from the fire through the rooms. The system had always been unreliable during severe storms. A sudden clatter echoed through the metal pipes as the wind pushed harder against the cabin. The small furnace sputtered once and then fell silent. Nathan frowned and stepped toward it, kneeling carefully to inspect the unit. A damaged vent pipe along the roofline had likely shifted during his fall or the earlier wind. Without proper airflow, the system would not function. The cabin temperature would drop quickly once the fire burned down. Outside, the storm intensified, wind roaring through the forest like distant thunder. Meanwhile, in Silver Hollow, the afternoon had darkened earlier than usual. Linda Harper stood behind the front window of Harper Books and Coffee, watching the sky as snow began falling again. The cafe had grown quiet. Most townspeople had hurried home before the storm worsened. Linda wiped the counter absent-mindedly while her eyes drifted toward the distant mountains beyond the town. Something felt different today. Normally, on clear days, she could see faint trails of smoke rising from cabins scattered along the hillsides near Echo Lake. Nathan's cabin chimney had become one of those small, familiar signals since she first noticed it weeks earlier. But now there was nothing. No thin line of smoke curling upward from the forest. Linda frowned slightly. A customer still seated near the window noticed her expression. It was Walter Green, who had stopped by for coffee before returning home. The old firefighter sat calmly with both hands wrapped around a mug, his white mustache catching the warm light of the cafe lamps. Walter followed Linda's gaze toward the mountains. "Storm's moving fast," he said quietly. Linda nodded but continued staring toward the hills. "I usually see smoke from Nathan's chimney this time of day," she said. Walter set down his mug slowly. The instincts that had guided him through decades of firefighting stirred quietly in his thoughts. "You think something's wrong?" Linda hesitated only a moment before answering. "I don't know," she admitted softly, "but it doesn't feel right." Outside, the snow began falling harder, the wind pushing white clouds across the empty street. Walter stood slowly, pulling on his heavy coat. Linda reached for her scarf. She looked toward him with quiet determination and said in a calm voice that carried both concern and resolve, "We should go check on him." Night fell heavily across the mountains around Echo Lake as the second storm of the week tightened its grip over the forest. Wind roared through the pine trees, bending branches until snow burst loose and spun through the air like white smoke. The sky had vanished behind thick clouds, leaving the mountains wrapped in a cold darkness broken only by the occasional pale shimmer of drifting snow. Inside Nathan Brooks's cabin, the fire in the stone hearth had begun to fade, the orange glow shrinking to dim embers that barely pushed back the chill creeping through the wooden walls. Nathan sat on the floor beside the hearth with his back against the rough log wall, his injured legs stretched stiffly before him. The fall from the roof earlier that afternoon had left his muscles aching and his knee swollen, making every movement slow and painful. He had managed to keep the fire alive for several hours, but the damaged heating vent and the fierce wind outside had drained the warmth faster than he could rebuild it. Ruby lay pressed against his side while Finn curled tightly between them, the small puppy's body radiating a fragile warmth that felt strangely powerful in the cold room. Ruby had refused to leave Nathan since the moment he stumbled through the door after his fall. The German Shepherd mother rested her head across his thigh, ignoring the discomfort in her bandaged leg, while her body shielded both Nathan and Finn from the creeping cold. Nathan exhaled slowly, his breath faint in the dim air. Years earlier, he had endured nights colder than this during missions in distant mountains, yet something about the quiet loyalty of the two dogs beside him made the moment feel different. Outside, the storm intensified, wind hammering the cabin roof while snow piled higher against the door. Several miles away, in the small town of Silver Hollow, the streets had emptied quickly as the blizzard grew stronger. Most homes glowed with warm yellow light behind shuttered windows, families gathering indoors while the storm passed through the mountains. But outside, Harper Books and Coffee, two figures stepped into the swirling snow carrying lanterns that flickered against the darkness. Linda Harper wrapped her wool coat tighter around her shoulders as the wind tugged at her scarf. Beside her walked Walter Green, his tall frame leaning slightly forward as he pushed against the storm with steady determination. Walter held a heavy brass lantern in one hand, while his other hand gripped the wooden railing along the snowy path that led from town toward the mountain trail. Despite his 71 years, the old firefighter still moved with deliberate strength, the same quiet persistence that had carried him through countless emergencies during his years serving the town. "Road's nearly gone under the snow," Walter said as they reached the edge of the forest trail. His breath drifted in white clouds beneath the lantern light. Linda nodded, though the worry in her hazel eyes remained steady. She had insisted on coming the moment she realized Nathan's chimney had remained dark all afternoon. Something about the quiet man who had rescued two frozen dogs from a storm had stayed in her thoughts longer than she expected. The trail through the forest was nearly invisible now, the snow reaching above their boots in some places. Walter walked slightly ahead, using a long wooden walking stick to test the ground beneath the drifts. Linda followed carefully behind him, the lantern in her hand casting warm circles of light across the swirling storm. After nearly half an hour of slow progress, the trees began to thin, and the faint outline of Nathan's cabin appeared through the snow. The building stood dark against the wind, its windows dim except for the faint glow of dying firelight inside. Walter lifted his lantern higher. There it is. They climbed the final slope toward the porch, snow crunching beneath their boots. Ruby heard them first. The German Shepherd lifted her head sharply and gave a low bark that echoed softly inside the cabin. Nathan stirred weakly and looked toward the door. The sound of knocking followed almost immediately. Linda pushed the door open, the lantern light spilling into the dim room. Her eyes quickly found Nathan sitting beside the hearth. "Nathan!" she exclaimed softly as she rushed forward. Walter stepped inside behind her, shutting the door quickly against the wind. He crouched beside Nathan and studied the older man's face with practiced attention. "Looks like you took a fall," Walter muttered, noticing the stiffness in Nathan's leg. Nathan gave a tired nod. Roof ice. Ruby remained pressed close to him while Finn shifted slightly beneath her fur. Linda knelt beside the dogs, her hand brushing gently across Ruby's neck. "They stayed with you," she whispered softly. Walter stood and glanced toward the nearly dead fire before quickly adding several logs from the wood crate. Flames rose again, spreading warmth through the room. "We're not staying long," Walter said calmly. "Storm's getting worse." Outside, another pair of headlights appeared slowly through the blowing snow. The engine of an old pickup rumbled faintly as it climbed the final stretch toward the cabin. Moments later, a knock sounded again. When Walter opened the door, Dr. Daniel Moore stepped inside, brushing snow from his shoulders. The veterinarian's glasses were fogged from the sudden warmth of the cabin, but his expression remained calm as always. "Heard there might be trouble up here," Daniel said, glancing at Nathan's leg before kneeling to examine it. After a brief inspection, he nodded thoughtfully. "Nothing broken, but he won't be walking far tonight." Nathan leaned back against the wall, exhaustion finally settling over him now that help had arrived. Linda glanced toward Ruby and Finn once more before turning back to Daniel and Walter. "We should take him somewhere warm," she said gently. Walter nodded in agreement. Together, they helped Nathan carefully to his feet and guided him toward the truck waiting outside. Ruby followed immediately, while Finn trotted close beside her small paws, disappearing into the snow. The storm howled around them as they settled Nathan into the back seat of Daniel's truck. Linda climbed into the passenger seat and looked back once at Nathan and the two dogs curled beside him. The road toward town vanished into the swirling white storm, but the truck began moving slowly forward through the darkness. Morning arrived slowly over Silver Hollow after the violent storm. The sky washed pale and clear as sunlight spilled across the snow-covered rooftops of the small mountain town. The storm had left deep drifts along the streets, but the wind had quieted and the air carried that rare stillness that often followed a night of chaos in the mountains. At the edge of town, Linda Harper's modest wooden house sat beside a narrow lane lined with bare maple trees, whose branches glittered with frost. Smoke rose gently from her chimney, curling upward into the cold blue sky. Inside the house, warmth filled every room, carried by the soft hum of the furnace and the comforting smell of coffee brewing in the kitchen. Nathan Brooks woke slowly on a small sofa near the living room window, the early light touching his weathered face as he shifted carefully and tested the injured leg beneath the blanket. The pain remained, but it had softened overnight, turning from sharp injury into a dull ache. He sat up slowly, noticing the quiet details of the room around him. Linda's house felt very different from his cabin beside Echo Lake. The walls were painted warm cream instead of bare pine, and framed photographs hung along the hallway. Small memories frozen behind glass. Some showed the town during summer festivals. Others captured moments of laughter between Linda and a tall man with kind eyes and dark hair. Nathan assumed the man must have been her husband. From the kitchen came the gentle sound of dishes moving and the low hum of a radio playing old country music. Ruby lay stretched on a woven rug near the sofa, while Finn bounded clumsily across the wooden floor, exploring every corner of the unfamiliar house with the boundless curiosity only young animals seemed to possess. Ruby's bandaged leg had improved enough for her to move comfortably again, though she still favored it slightly. Every few seconds she glanced toward Nathan, as if confirming he was still safe. When Nathan shifted upright, she lifted her head and wagged her tail once against the rug. Finn immediately noticed and trotted toward him with unsteady enthusiasm, his small paws slipping slightly on the polished floorboards before he reached Nathan's hand. Nathan scratched the puppy gently beneath the chin and felt the familiar quiet warmth of living companionship return. The house that once belonged only to Linda now echoed with the small sounds of movement, paws against wood, a wagging tail brushing against furniture, the soft breath of dogs resting in the sunlight. Linda stepped into the living room carrying 2 mugs of coffee. Her chestnut hair had been pulled loosely into a braid over one shoulder, and she wore a soft gray sweater that contrasted gently with her warm hazel eyes. She moved with a calm grace shaped by years of quiet routines. "You're awake," she said with a small smile as she handed Nathan a mug. Nathan accepted it carefully. "Feels like I slept through half the winter." Linda laughed softly and glanced toward Finn, who had begun chasing his own tail near the hallway. "The house hasn't had this much activity in years," she admitted. Nathan noticed the way her eyes followed the puppy, the way her smile softened the faint lines of grief that still lived quietly in her expression. "Your husband liked animals?" Nathan asked gently. Linda paused for a moment before nodding. "Daniel loved them," she said. He always said animals remind us how simple loyalty can be. She sat in the chair beside the window and looked out toward the backyard where the snow lay untouched except for the small path Walter Green had shoveled earlier that morning. Outside, Ruby and Finn soon found their way through the back door Linda had left slightly open for them. The yard stretched behind the house like a small winter field, bordered by a wooden fence and a row of old spruce trees. Finn ran in uneven circles through the snow while Ruby followed at a slower pace, her protective gaze never leaving the puppy for long. Nathan watched them through the window. The sight stirred something steady inside him that had been absent for a long time. Later that afternoon, Walter Green arrived, stomping snow from his boots as he entered through the front door. The older man carried a toolbox in one hand and wore his thick wool coat despite the warmer sunlight outside. Walter had spent most of the morning helping neighbors clear snow from their driveways, an old habit he had never abandoned even after retirement. "Leg holding up?" Walter asked Nathan as he set the toolbox down. Nathan nodded slightly. "I'll live." Walter glanced toward the backyard where Ruby and Finn played. A faint smile lifted beneath his white mustache. "Looks like they will too." A short while later, another visitor arrived. Dr. Daniel Moore stepped through the doorway carrying a small medical bag, his glasses glinting faintly in the afternoon light. Daniel checked Nathan's leg with calm efficiency, adjusting the bandage and confirming the injury would heal with rest. "You'll need a few more days off that cabin ladder," he advised gently. Linda leaned against the kitchen counter listening quietly while the men spoke. Then she glanced out toward the snowy yard again, where Ruby nudged Finn playfully through the drifts. Something thoughtful passed through her expression. "Nathan," she said slowly, drawing the attention of the room. "Your cabin." Nathan looked toward her. Linda folded her hands thoughtfully before continuing. "That place sits alone up by the lake, quiet, warm, sturdy." Walter raised an eyebrow slightly, already sensing an idea forming. Linda continued, her voice calm but hopeful. "What if it didn't stay empty when you're not there?" Nathan frowned slightly, unsure where she was going. Linda nodded toward the dogs outside. "Animals get abandoned around these mountains every winter. Strays, injured dogs, lost pets. Daniel sees them all the time." Daniel Moore nodded quietly in agreement. Walter leaned back against the wall with interest. Linda finished gently. "What if your cabin became a place for them? A shelter for animals that have nowhere else to go?" The idea settled into the quiet room like a small spark of warmth. Nathan watched Ruby and Finn running across the yard while snowflakes fell lightly from the trees. For the first time since returning from his lonely cabin life, the future felt less like a long, empty road. Nathan exhaled slowly and looked toward Linda, Walter, and Daniel. Then his gaze returned to Ruby and Finn playing in the winter sunlight. "Maybe," he said quietly, "I should stay in Silver Hollow for a while." Morning sunlight spread gently across the snow-covered valley of Silver Hollow as winter finally loosened its grip on the mountains. The storm that had shaken the town only days earlier had moved east, leaving behind a clear sky and a calm stillness that seemed almost peaceful after so much wind and uncertainty. Smoke curled slowly from chimneys across the small town as people began stepping outside again, shoveling paths through snowbanks and checking on neighbors. Inside Linda Harper's modest home near the edge of town, Nathan Brooks sat comfortably near the front window with his injured leg resting on a wooden stool. The swelling had faded somewhat since the night Walter and Linda brought him down from Echo Lake, though the leg remained stiff enough to remind him that he would not be climbing roofs any time soon. Ruby lay at his feet beside the rug while Finn bounded clumsily across the living room floor, his puppy energy growing stronger with every passing day. The small German Shepherd pup had discovered that Linda's home offered endless opportunities for exploration, from chair legs to bookshelves, and the faintly creaking wooden staircase that fascinated him endlessly. Ruby watched him with patient tolerance, occasionally nudging him gently when his enthusiasm became too reckless. Nathan leaned back in the chair, observing the lively chaos with quiet amusement. Linda's house had once been known for its peaceful silence, the kind of quiet that often settles into homes where only one person lives. Now it echoed with soft footsteps, playful barking, and the occasional clatter of a curious puppy investigating unfamiliar corners. Linda moved through the kitchen preparing coffee, her chestnut hair tied loosely behind her neck while the morning sunlight reflected off the soft silver strands beginning to appear near her temples. She carried 2 mugs to the table and placed one in Nathan's hand with a warm smile. "You're healing faster than I expected," she said gently. Nathan glanced down at Ruby and Finn before answering. "Helps when there's something worth getting up for." Outside the window, several pickup trucks rolled slowly down the snowy road toward the center of town. Linda followed his gaze and smiled knowingly. "Looks like Walter started early," she said. Nathan raised an eyebrow. Linda nodded toward the road. "He's gathering volunteers." An hour later, the small convoy of trucks and trailers began climbing the narrow road that led back toward Echo Lake. Nathan rode in the passenger seat of Walter Green's truck, while Ruby and Finn occupied the back seat. Their noses pressed eagerly against the window as the forest slowly reappeared around them. Walter drove carefully through the snowy trail, his weathered hands steady on the wheel. The retired firefighter had a quiet way of organizing people that came from years of coordinating emergency crews during difficult situations. "Town figured if that cabin's going to stand through winter," Walter said, "it might as well serve a purpose." When they reached the clearing near Nathan's cabin, the scene surprised even him. Nearly a dozen people from Silver Hollow had already gathered around the small structure. Some carried lumber, while others unloaded stacks of firewood and tools from truck beds. The cabin that had once stood alone beside Echo Lake now buzzed with activity. Among the volunteers was Daniel Moore, who had arrived earlier carrying medical supplies for animals that might need treatment. Beside him worked a tall woman named Grace Whitaker, the town's postmaster, who had rolled up her sleeves and was helping stack firewood near the porch. Grace Whitaker was in her mid-40s with a sturdy build and practical demeanor that came from years of managing the town's small post office alone. Her dark hair was always tied back in a tight braid, and her voice carried a friendly authority that made people listen when she spoke. Though she spent most of her days sorting letters and packages, Grace had a reputation for stepping forward whenever the town needed extra hands. "Look who finally made it," she called cheerfully when Nathan stepped out of the truck. Nathan stood quietly for a moment, surprised by the sight before him. Walter clapped a heavy hand on his shoulder. "You saved those dogs," he said simply. "Town figured the least we could do was help fix the place." Ruby trotted across the clearing immediately, greeting the volunteers with cautious curiosity while Finn followed with unsteady excitement. The puppy stumbled through the snow and rolled once before bouncing back to his feet, earning laughter from several townspeople nearby. Daniel approached Nathan with a friendly nod. "Your cabin's about to become the busiest place near Echo Lake," he said. Nathan looked around at the growing activity. New boards were being lifted toward the roof while others repaired the damaged vent pipe that had caused the heating system to fail. Walter directed several men toward the woodpile, while Grace organized supplies beside the porch. The sense of shared effort filled the clearing with an energy Nathan had not felt in years. By afternoon, the cabin looked stronger than it had before the storm. Fresh boards reinforced the roof while stacks of wood lined the wall near the door. Inside, Daniel and Linda began arranging simple crates and blankets along the far side of the main room, transforming the space into a small shelter for injured or abandoned animals. "We'll keep basic supplies here," Daniel explained while setting down a box of medical bandages. "Nothing complicated, just a place where animals can recover before we find them homes." Linda stood beside him, brushing dust from her hands. "And the cafe will stay open late for volunteers," she added with a soft smile. As the sun dipped lower behind the mountains, the volunteers slowly gathered near the cabin porch, warming their hands around cups of coffee Linda had brought in a large metal thermos. The forest glowed orange in the fading light while Echo Lake shimmered faintly beyond the trees. Nathan stood quietly beside Ruby and Finn, watching the small group of townspeople laughing together. For years he had believed that solitude was the only way forward after losing the life he once knew. But now he felt something unexpected stirring again. Not loneliness, not silence, something closer to belonging. Spring arrived slowly in the mountains around Silver Hollow, melting away the long grip of winter with quiet patience. Snow retreated from the hillsides in uneven patches, while small streams of clear water began trickling beneath the trees, carrying the cold memory of winter down toward Echo Lake. The lake itself had finally begun to thaw along the edges, thin sheets of ice drifting slowly across its surface like broken mirrors under the pale sunlight. The forest that had once stood silent beneath heavy snow now carried the gentle sounds of returning life. Birds calling from the branches, wind whispering through new buds, and the distant murmur of flowing water hidden beneath rocks. Near the lake, Nathan Brooks stood in front of the old cabin that had once been only his quiet refuge from the world. The building looked different now. Over the past weeks, the townspeople of Silver Hollow had transformed it with steady hands and generous hearts. Fresh planks reinforced the porch. The damaged roof had been repaired with new cedar shingles, and a wide fenced yard had been built beside the cabin where animals could roam safely. A wooden post stood beside the path leading toward the front door. Nathan held a hammer in one hand as he carefully secured a freshly painted sign onto the post. The words had been carved into the wood by Walter Green himself during one long evening beside the fire in Linda's cafe. The letters were simple but steady, shaped by Walter's strong hands despite his age. When Nathan stepped back, the sign read clearly in dark painted letters, "Silver Hollow Haven, Shelter for Lost Souls." Ruby ran across the green grass nearby with her bandaged leg now fully healed, her powerful body moving with the confident grace of a dog who had survived more than most creatures should endure. Finn followed her with playful energy, his once fragile body now stronger, his ears bouncing with every leap through the spring grass. The puppy who had once struggled to breathe during a winter night now chased butterflies across the yard with endless curiosity. Nathan watched them with quiet satisfaction as he wiped his hands on a cloth. His beard had grown slightly thicker over the past weeks, and the silver threads in his hair shone softly under the warm sunlight. Though his injured leg still reminded him of the fall during cold mornings, the stiffness had begun to fade as spring warmed the ground beneath his boots. The cabin door opened behind him, and Linda Harper stepped outside carrying 2 mugs of coffee. She had chosen a light blue shirt that matched the spring sky, and her chestnut hair now hung loosely around her shoulders instead of the tight braid she often wore during winter work at the cafe. Her hazel eyes held a brightness Nathan had begun to recognize as quiet happiness rather than simple kindness. She walked down the porch steps and handed him one of the mugs. "The sign looks perfect," she said softly. Nathan glanced at the carved letters again before nodding. Walter did most of the work. Linda smiled. "He said he hasn't carved wood like that since he built toys for his grandchildren 20 years ago." From inside the cabin came the faint sound of metal bowls clinking together. Dr. Daniel Moore soon appeared in the doorway, adjusting his glasses while holding a clipboard in one hand. Daniel had begun visiting the cabin regularly during the past month, helping organize the growing number of animals that townspeople had brought to the new shelter. Behind him walked a young woman Nathan had not met before. Her name was Sarah Caldwell, a volunteer who had recently moved to Silver Hollow after finishing college in Denver. Sarah was in her late 20s with a tall, slender frame and sun-browned skin that hinted at years spent hiking in the mountains. Her long, dark hair was tied into a loose ponytail, and her green eyes carried the alert curiosity of someone eager to help wherever she could. Sarah knelt near a wooden crate beside the porch, where a small gray kitten peeked cautiously from inside. The kitten had arrived only 2 days earlier, after a farmer discovered it hiding inside his barn. Its fur was a smoky mix of silver and white, and its tiny paws moved carefully as it explored the unfamiliar world. Sarah spoke gently to it, her calm voice revealing a natural patience with animals. "He's braver today," she said as she lifted the kitten carefully into her hands. Daniel nodded approvingly. Most animals recover faster once they feel safe. Nathan leaned against the porch railing while watching the small scene unfold. During the past weeks, more townspeople had visited the cabin than he had spoken to in the past 10 years combined. Walter had helped rebuild the roof and fences, Daniel had organized medical care for injured animals, and Linda had turned her cafe into an unofficial meeting place where volunteers gathered each evening to share stories and plan the next improvements for the shelter. Even travelers passing through the mountains had begun stopping by after hearing about the place that cared for abandoned animals. Ruby trotted toward the porch and rested her head against Nathan's knee while Finn continued chasing something invisible in the grass. Nathan placed one hand gently on Ruby's head, feeling the warmth of her fur beneath his fingers. For a long moment, he simply watched the quiet life unfolding around him, the laughter of volunteers, the movement of animals exploring the yard, the steady presence of Linda standing beside him with a cup of coffee warming her hands. He spoke quietly, almost as if thinking aloud. "I always thought I rescued them that night in the storm." Ruby lifted her head slightly when she heard his voice. Linda glanced at him and then down at the German shepherd resting against his leg. A small smile appeared on her face, the kind that carried understanding rather than amusement. She placed one hand gently on Nathan's arm and said softly, "No, they rescued you." Nathan looked across the green yard once more where Finn now tumbled clumsily beside Ruby in the spring sunlight. The cabin behind him no longer felt like a lonely shelter in the wilderness. It had become something else entirely, a place where broken journeys ended and new ones began. Sometimes the greatest miracles do not arrive with thunder or bright light. Sometimes they appear quietly on a lonely road in the middle of a storm, in the form of a life that simply refuses to give up. Nathan thought he was the one saving Ruby and Finn that night. But the truth is that God often sends help in ways we do not expect. A wounded dog, a small, trembling puppy, a neighbor who knocks on the door, a stranger who chooses kindness. These are the small threads through which grace quietly enters our lives. In our everyday routines, we often forget that compassion is one of the greatest gifts we can offer. When we choose to care, when we choose to stop instead of passing by, we become part of something bigger than ourselves. Perhaps that is how miracles really work. God places moments in our path, and it is our hearts that decide whether we will see them. If this story touched your heart, take a moment today to show kindness to someone or something that needs it, because you never know whose life you might change, or how it might change your own. Share this story with someone who believes in hope. Leave a comment telling us where you are watching from, and subscribe to the channel so more stories of faith, compassion, and second chances can reach people around the world. And wherever you are today, may God watch over you, protect your home, and fill your life with quiet miracles when you need them most.